Hello YouTube, today we're talking knee flexion and hip hinges and their impact on the squat and deadlift. And this video is going to actually have three main themes in them. The first one is going to be natural movement patterns that I discussed last week in this playlist. The second one is going to be the muscle activation that comes with knee flexions and hip hinge movements. And the third one is going to mostly be technique errors and what I would call artificially induced movement pattern mechanisms that I see in certain people's squats and deads that I think are clear indications that there's something wrong with their understanding of how to move a human body. And you might ask yourself, well, why is this in the injury prevention playlist if we're talking mostly technique and muscle activation? The reason is because all of what I'm going to tell you today is going to allow you to stay injury-free because it's going to espouse movement patterns that your body naturally does that is very beneficial for it, basically, where it's going to promote muscle growth, it's going to promote use of the muscles, and it's going to deload the tendons and the structure a lot. So we're going to get into that. This video is not going to be as complex as you think, it's actually going to be super simple. So let's start about talking about knee flexions and hip hinges. What is a knee flexion? It's a bend of the knee. What is a hip hinge? It's a bend of the hip. Which means that for each movement, you're going to recruit a certain amount of muscles through the bending of a tendon. So if you want to think about it a certain way, movement patterns are really centered around the utilization of a joint that is going to activate the surrounding muscles. And those are natural, humans do them all the time. There is nothing unnatural about a squat. If someone tells you the squat is not functional and they tell you a pull-up is more functional, that's completely idiotic. You are going to do knee flexions much more often than you climb in things. The vertical pull is one of the least functional movement for the average human. If you're an athlete or a climber, then yes, maybe, but most people are going to be much better off doing squats. I say that why? I say that because we all move the same way. We have differences in leverages that are going to modify the technique, the stance, etc. But in reality, we're all made after the same model. Meaning that the way you squat is the same way I squat. We engage the same tendons and muscles. We just don't engage them the same way. And we might have to find certain ways to engage them the proper way. As far as the knee flexion and the hip hinge, you will quickly find that they do not exist without one another. Doing a pure knee flexion with just body weight is not possible. It just isn't. Without holding onto something, you will have to break into a hip hinge at some point. Why? Because if you don't, you won't be able to descend anymore. It's the same for the hip hinge. You can, to a point, keep the legs straight, but there's going to come to a certain torso angle where you're either going to have to round the lower back or you're going to have to bend at the knee if you want to continue going lower. What does that tell you? It tells you that there's a natural inclination of the body to require the both movement patterns at the same time. And that's perfectly logical and it makes total sense. Your body wants you to utilize as many muscle groups as possible. So when you do a pure knee flexion, the knee flexion recruits what? The quads. Does your body want you to only use your quads to move? No, it wants you to use the massive muscularity of your posterior chain. So it's going to push you into a hip hinge. Same logic with the hip hinge. You go into the hip hinge and at some point, the body is not able to recruit the glutes and the hamstrings anymore and it wants to. It also wants to get some quad activation in there because why not? So it forces you into a knee flexion. These movements are normal. Do not try to circumvent them. There is a point in bodybuilding where I think we've pushed the ball too far and we try to find movements that are too isolation based, things that are going to target small muscle groups. When you think about it, why are you doing this? You would be much better off just doing something heavier, safer, that would give you more tonnage, right? And if you really want to target that small muscle because it's lagging or something, you do it afterwards. But that practice of isolation does not replace the practice of compound movements. So that's sort of the introduction. I say that why? Because I do think many people either don't understand that or they don't really want to accept that fact. And there's too much of that in modern bodybuilding and I think it's very detrimental for everyone. people who are going to do squats with way too much of a vertical torso angle, they're going to try and find ways to only recruit their quads. That is going to be very conducive to knee injuries, because you find that the knee joint requires the engagement of the hamstring to stay healthy over time. And it's the same for the hip hinge. What happens when you do a pure hip hinge? When you find a way to force the body to do a pure hip hinge, you develop lower back pain, or you tear a hamstring. Why? You pushed the flexibility of the hamstring too much because you forced it into compensating for the lack of quad activation. And it's the same for a potential glute injury or a potential lower back injury. You don't let your body do what it does best, which is diffusing the stress. Your body is trying to make sure that you don't break. So it's going to force you into certain movement patterns. That disqualifies the practice of good mornings with completely straight legs. It disqualifies a lot of squat variations that force you to have a perfectly, neutral hip placement where the hip never hinges at all. Thankfully, those are sort of rare, meaning that most movements, whether you like it or not, even if they're quad focused or hamstring focused, you still get some level of one or the other. When you do a leg press, you still get some hip hinge in there. Most people who think that they're doing their good mornings strict, they still give in to some knee flexion in there. The logic and the bottom line of that is, don't resist those things. Try and mitigate them, meaning that, of course, if you end up doing a good morning with way too much knee flexion, what are you doing? You're doing a squat, you're doing a low bar squat. You don't want that. So the practice that I would tell anyone to do is find a way to train those movement patterns with the majority of the tonnage going where you want it to go without completely sabotaging the way your body wants to move. When you do a squat, do not resist the hip hinge. Go with it, okay? Accompany the weight. And you'll see that once you accept that your body is going into those stances, you can actually get good enough at the technique that you're going to limit the amount of deviation of form that would be acceptable. And I see the opposite too much. I see people who try to abide by forms that are unrealistic, and when they fail spectacularly, meaning that they will resist hip hinges like maniacs, but then at some point, their structural integrity will give, and they'll just do a complete good morning for a squat, for example. And that's when you get injured, because you forced your body into resisting hip hinges for so long that now that movement pattern is weak, and then you suddenly put that body into a hip hinge with a position that is not suited for that movement, and it snaps. Why wouldn't it snap? Same logic for the knee flexions and for the hip hinges. If you try and resist going into a knee flexion too much when you do hip hinges, you might eventually get into a position where you're going to have an injury that's going to occur because of that resistance. So you want to avoid that. And as far as deadlifts and squats, those are movements that once you've practiced them enough, it's like biking, you know how to do them. And now we're going to get into the counterpart of that, because there are a lot of people who have never really thought about what I just told you about. And they don't realize that the synergistic nature of those movement patterns of the knee flexion and the hip hinge exists for a reason. But they still have in their mind the idea of what the correct form for these lifts would look like if they abided by what I just described. So they try to replicate it with visual cues. And I will talk about that more, but you don't want to base your technique off of visual cues, and you cannot judge the form of someone off of visual cues. That might sound counterintuitive, because if I see someone and their lower back rounds on the deadlift and I'm calling it out, you might say, well, you just called it out because you saw their back rounding. That's a visual cue. No, the lower back rounding it's a symptom. It's a symptom of what? Of the hips shooting up. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to cure. It's the hips shooting up, and it's the fact that the posterior chain was not engaged and there was no thoracic extension. Those are not visual cues. Those are intrinsic cues to the lifts that were then symptomatic, that then were exemplified by the symptom that is the lower back rounding. And that's important to keep in mind. And it's important why? Because for the people who can't take that in and who think that it's all visual, what will they then start to do? They're going to start and replicate the visual cues that they see in proper form by following the stages that the movement pattern does, and for the most part, they can't do it. Why? Because the movement pattern and the way it feels is a personal feeling. It's something that happens in the mind and in the muscles, meaning that you need to be able to do it to feel it, okay? And if you don't get that portion of what I just described, what you're going to end up doing is you're trying to mimic the natural succession of what the body does. And what I mean by that is this. When you do a squat, a proper squat is what? There's a knee flexion. So that's what initiates the movement to start with. As you go into the knee flexion and your body descends, your body naturally is trying to correct its position because it senses that it cannot go any lower. And what happens in that case? You start to slowly have a shift in torso angle, which triggers a hip hinge. And when you're at the bottom of the lift, when you push back up, you go out of that hip hinge because at some point the body doesn't need you in that position anymore because you're stable enough that you can just finish the movement with a pure undoing of the knee flexion, so a pressure of the legs. That's a good squat, okay? Now, what would someone who doesn't understand movement pattern synergy do? They'll think, okay, it's a knee flexion, but I cannot let myself just flex the knees. I need to also engage the posterior chain. So what do? They push their butts back. And you see that all the time on the squat. They're up, good position, neutral back, and they suddenly push the butt back. They haven't started the movement yet. What they're doing is they're artificially triggering the proper movement pattern succession, but they don't do it the right way. Because if you push your butt back before the knee flexion has occurred, what are you doing? You're shifting your center of gravity back, meaning what? Meaning that as you go down, you're going to have much more of a torso angle lean. And unlike what most people might think, it's actually going to reduce the engagement of the glutes and the hamstrings. And you will find that because it reduces that engagement, it leads to a good morning squat. So that's something you don't want. When you start a knee flexion, your body is naturally going to try and recruit as much hamstring and glutes as it can as you bend forward. If you immediately push the butt back, you're going to end up using much more lower back, which we want to avoid. So that's the poor application of human movement patterns for a squat with weight. Now let's talk about the deadlift, because the deadlift is also the juicy part, and I will relate that to the squat as well. So as far as the deadlift, what is a proper deadlift? A proper deadlift is, and outside of the normal setups, because I'm not here to teach you how to deadlift, I'm here to teach you how to move. You get in position, you bend at the knee, okay? You don't squat down to the bar. That's the first mistake that people do. You just simply bend at the knee, and as you do that, you push the butt back and you reach for the bar. That's how you get into a proper deadlift setup. Once you've grabbed the bar, depending on how you set up afterwards, you're going to try and replicate that same thing you just did before you initiate the pull, meaning that you're going to want to have the shoulders over the bar, you're going to want to have some degree of knee flexion, and you're going to want to feel like you're over the bar and you're just waiting to stand up with it. A lot of people, when they hear that same logic, they over exaggerate it, so they go into too much of a knee flexion and they are basically way behind the bar. So that's not even a hip hinge anymore. You're doing a weird half squat, and usually it doesn't work. Why? Because of the center of gravity being way too far back. And in that case, it's the same logic. It's thinking too much about over involving the knee in the movement. The knee flexing is a cue to activate and trigger the posterior chain. It's the same for the slight hip hinge in the squat. It does not become the main mover. You cannot make it become the main mover on a conventional deadlift. And as far as the deadlift goes, I think that the most, not necessarily upsetting, but the most common mistake you see after that, because it's not over, it's the over-exaggeration of the lockout. Meaning that you'll see people push their hips in the bar so much that their back is like this. And their glutes are completely squeezed and in. And the hips are pushing the bar way too much. That's not how you lock a deadlift, okay? I know that it's become very common for that movement to be associated with the lockout, but a proper lockout is neutral back, all of the joints are aligned, and you're standing up. You don't have to over exaggerate it. And I know where it came from. Most of the time, it's people who have a weak lockout and they have soft knees. And when you push your hips into the bar, it gives the illusion of a strong lockout. It's especially true with sumo. You'll find that a lot of sumo lifters do that because of the difficulty of locking out a sumo. They will have a tendency, and it's not necessarily a difficulty because of the strength curves of the lift, because the lockout is supposed to be the easy part of the sumo, but the position is awkward, and it gives the visually, and again visual cues, visually a locked sumo sometimes doesn't look locked. Why? Because of the angle of the legs. It's tough to see if the legs are actually strong or if the lockout is soft. So what lots of these guys will do is they'll start to lean back so that it aligns with the hips better, and it gives the illusion of a lockout. Sometimes it's not locked, but they get away with it. And that misapplication of form has then started to spread to the point where some people will believe that if you don't do it, if you don't do the weird lean back thing, then it's not locked. That first off, that lean back is dangerous for the back because you go from the strongest position to a weakened position with the hips that are not aligned with the upper back anymore, especially for conventional. And secondly, you will also find that it's, again, not using the muscles to their full application. Because why do people do that? It's people who've heard that to lock a deadlift, you need to utilize the musculature of your glutes. And that's true. But that the development of power of the glutes occurs throughout the movement. It doesn't occur at lockout. Lockout is the end of the movement. You don't need to add an extra hip thrust in there. It's locked. So usually it's people who end up, as I said, with soft knees because they didn't manage to lock properly. And when you have soft knees, you're pretty much screwed because it's usually a structural issue, meaning that your form was not correct. So they have two choices. Either they hitch or they do that hip thing where they push back, but it's in both cases it's not locked properly. And for muscle activation, that's a big issue. And as far as knee flexions and hip hinges, this is pretty much what you have to keep in mind. Your body knows what to do. You might have spent years and years and years misapplying those movement patterns, and you taught your body how to move the wrong way, and your body eventually just followed your guide. But you will find that these are correctable, and you will immediately be able to click once you apply the proper movement patterns, because it will just make sense. It will not be painful. It will feel like all of the muscles are activated to their fullest. And that's the type of form that is not only the most beneficial as far as technique goes and injury prevention, as I said, but it's also the most beneficial for hypertrophy because you get the most amount of tonnage, and it's repeatable because that's the way your body actually wants to move. So make sure when you do a knee flexion or hip hinge that you get a level of involvement of both in both cases, but don't exaggerate it. I hope that both of the sides of the coins that I showed you gave you examples of things not to do. Because sadly, I can make a video where I show you how to hip hinge, but until you apply it to you and your own leverages, you won't get it. So keep what I said in mind to avoid the pitfalls and practice to get good at moving your body because you're going to be moving it for a long time. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.